Welcome to Seeds and Bones, a seasonal podcast on food, land, and belonging. This is a space for slower conversations about the systems that feed us and the ways that we feed them in return, where we trace the threads between soil and bodies, animals and culture, policy and plate, and where we remember that we are not standing outside these systems. We are shaped by them and shaping them every day. I'm Dr. Alexia Meller, a former artist academic turned holistic canine nutrition consultant, exploring nourishment as something that begins in the soil and moves through bodies, species, and story. I'm joined by Olivia Shave, a sustainability strategist and former sheep farmer, working to weave food, farming, and climate back into the heart of education and public life. And Dr. Daphne Ducrot, a food policy scholar and community food resilience practitioner, tending the connections that help communities grow stronger, more sovereign food futures. We come together from different paths, practice, policy, and participation, to ask what it means to live, eat, farm, teach, and choose as if we are both ancestors and descendants. We're so glad you're here. What happens when we stop trying to manage the living world and begin learning how to belong to it again? In this early summer conversation, released under May's blue moon, a full moon that is often associated with culmination, illumination, and release, we gather around the themes of soil, regeneration, relationship, and the unraveling of the old stories that taught us that we were separate from nature rather than part of it. The full moon has long been a time of seeing clearly, of bringing hidden patterns into the light, of letting go of what can no longer be carried forward. And perhaps that is part of what this moment is asking of us collectively, to release the consciousness of domination, extraction, control, and separation that has shaped so much of our relationship with land, animals, food, community, and even ourselves. Together, we explore the myth of dominion, the inherited belief that land, animals, seeds, and even our own bodies exist to be controlled, optimized, and mastered. And what begins to shift when we move instead toward participation, reciprocity, and deep relationship. From regenerative farming and lunar rhythms to the impacts of flea and tick chemicals, seed sovereignty, systems thinking, and community resilience, this episode weaves together ecology, agriculture, activism, spirituality, and the remembering that healing rarely happens in isolation. We ask, what happens when we stop seeing animals as units of production and begin relating to them as ecological partners? And what if regeneration is not something that we do to the earth, but something we participate in alongside her? This conversation is also about the collapse of what no longer serves. Systems built on extraction, separation, fear, and control. And about the quieter, slower emergence of something else. Trust, community, humility, ancestral remembering, and the courage to re-enter relationship with the living world. Because perhaps rewilding the land also requires rewilding ourselves. So wherever you're listening from, we invite you to slow down, soften your grip, and listen closely to what the natural world around us might already be trying to teach us. Let's dive in. Hello, ladies. We're back for another episode.
Hi.
How is
are
everyone?
you?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Brilliant, thank you. Really good.
Good.
Good. I am looking forward to this conversation today as we have been going back and forth with one another. And just before we started recording, kind of revisiting where we are at and what is standing out for us. And we are in the season of Beltane. And I think something that's really important that you brought up, Olivia, was around how we get into more of a rhythm with the seasons that doesn't necessarily look like something that's fixed to the calendar and linear, and looking historically at Beltane being the start of the fire seasons. And it's this kind of catalyst. Things are starting to bloom. There's the awakening, as you said, and this kind of big energy that's coming forward. And we have, in modern times, assigned that to the 1st of May because that's kind of convenient for us. But when you look traditionally at the celebrations of these kinds of festivals, they are somewhat movable and they are in response to what is going on in the particular environment. And alongside that, I was listening to somebody that I follow online who's into more of the witchy stuff. And she was talking about the big Beltane celebrations that happen in Edinburgh and how normally she goes to that every year, but she wasn't able to do it this year because of things going on in her family. And she used that as an opportunity to talk about exactly this, that your personal life might not line up with these seasons and celebrations necessarily as they fall on the calendar, and that is okay, and we're meant to lead with what is coming up in our own lives and honor the spirit of that season. And so with the spirit of the Beltane season, today we're talking about this awakening that's happening. And I think part of the consciousness awakening that ties into this is this notion of how we start to change from a mindset of dominion that can show up in a variety of different ways of control
Mm,
over the natural environment, over the calendar, over ourselves, and actually switch into a mindset of responsiveness and
mm.
collaboration and cooperation. So that's going to be a kind of guiding theme for us today that Beltane is kind of sparking, at least for me. Is there something that's coming up for you guys that you want to make sure we focus on?
No, I just I love that the fact that things around us do not conform to a date, like you say, the first Beltane. Everything is movable and it shifts depending on what we're doing, and there's farmers, they're looking to the land to show them signs, and there's life in soil. There's, it's all starting to warm up, and the lambs are arriving, seeds are germinating, and insects start to return. But that's all very geographical as well. Weather determines a lot of this, and we've got a really cold patch this week, so it's not behaving in the way that we would like. And but I love the fact we're discussing Beltane and Dominion and how we fit into that belonging. So yeah, I can't wait to get going on this.
I think for me, the what have I noted down here? I think it's really interesting that at this time of year, Alexia, you described it as the point where everything's just sort of bursting into life. But in our chat before, we sort of talked about being called to also slow down. And what that tells me is being called to notice, being called to be a part of our landscape. And it seems as though you look at the trees one day and they're bare, and then you look a day or two later and go, oh my gosh, everything is green. Or you suddenly notice the blossoms when you're driving. And as somebody who has an orchard, I can go, ah, the plums are going, or the damsons are going, or the apples are going. And you can see this sort of this cycle that each of these plants are are popping out at in a certain time. There's a rhythm to it. And just being dialed in enough to notice it is something really special. And
Mm,
recently I've seen this wonderful quote from the magical Wendell Berry that I'll read out because I think it's really relevant to this conversation, but also where we are in time. And he says, "It's easy for me to imagine that the next great division of the world will be between the people who wish to live as creatures and the people who wish to live as machines." And I think that that mechanization, that dominion, we're seeing that divide now, but we're also seeing a great shift of people coming back to wanting to be humans, to connect with land, to connect with their food, to connect with live comedy and concerts and going to shows and human experiences that can't be AI generated. So I think that we have to push back against that dominion, slow down and notice what makes us real and what makes us connected. So that's my little wiggle on it.
I
That
love
is
that little
beautiful.
wiggle on
Mm.
it.
I think it's very true. I mean, I see that in many different spheres that in reality, this the kind of dominance of the machine and the sort of dominance of culture or the dominance within culture is having such a negative impact on us where there is this kind of backlash of you see this like the slow movements. There's a lot of like offline clubs that are popping up where people are specifically about putting our technology down, people craving what is quote unquote real. And I think it's actually this invitation for us to rediscover what real is and what it means to be human, which is something that I ask a lot within my own work, and how these things that are happening around us are this invitation, this gateway, this portal for us to ask those important questions. Because when we understand better, not that there is a distinct answer, but it's the process of asking those questions, there's a becoming that is kind of instigated around what it means to be human. We start to engage very differently. And it starts that process of what we were talking about at the beginning, just before we started recording, about ideas of regeneration and renewal that we have talked about as methodologies in the kind of contemporary context. But in reality, they are a much deeper, esoteric inner travel, inner process, inner deconstructing the things that we have used to hold up our narratives around what the world needs to look like. And Olivia, I wondered if this might actually be a good time to sort of dive into your work specifically that you have done around not only as your contemporary in your kind of present work of looking at soil and policy and really getting people to understand soil as a living counterpart to us that we are all reliant upon, but also from the very direct experience that you had within farming and how that is informing the way that you're thinking about regeneration as a move away from just kind of a modality into a deeper understanding.
Definitely. I think Dominion tells us that humans sit at the top of the hierarchy, right? And I think, across the world, farmers are asking similar questions reality. I think we hear stories worldwide. South Africa, there's growers are defending their right to use traditional seed variations that yield less but preserve resilience, I guess, diversity and autonomy. So the detail then becomes deeper, and that deeper than productivity, should I say. It becomes about the rights of seed, the rights of soil, and ultimately our own relationship to that, and to nature in the wider sense. The regeneration asks humility of us,
Mm.
and it asks us to listen, to slow down, and to notice. And as a farmer, that we've always gone down the holistic route where we observe the land and it tells us what to do, how to action, how to change things. And with sheep, we've always followed the moon phases, so we always top with the moon phases. And there's such a peaceful way of farming. Your actions teach you to slow down with the rhythms of nature, but also you can observe it with the animals. They are almost so much more fertile at that stage when you do it. And I know a lot of people would question this, but equally I know a lot of people who do follow this way of topping, not just through a system that you have to top, you have to lamb on this date, you have to hit the markets at this date. And if you're following the whole cycle around from topping time to lambing time to then eventually having a product at the end of it, you're much better off for it. The meat has a much better taste. We all know that slow raised meat is better. And it's just had a chance to, everything has had a chance to slow down. But I guess for me, I'm a believer that Mother Nature throws at us what she will. She provides all the signs that we need to work with, and therefore, even when you're topping with the moon, you also got the foraging to complement that with natural hedgerows and that which the sheep need. And it's just, I think under Dominion, the land becomes a machine, which is something Daphne's touched on. Inputs go in, outputs go out, and that's not enough. Only if you are truly working for a profit-based business, and efficiency becomes virtue. Control becomes success, and that's how it's measured. And the mindset didn't appear overnight. It gradually grew through industrialization, mechanism, separation from humans, from land. Knowledge has been divided into disciplines. I mean, the list goes on. So yeah, I'm a huge advocate for this. But there was something that it's gone now, but Daphne touched on something before we was recording that just made me sit up, and I'm sure it will come back to me. Sorry, it's the age thing. I go into a little rant, and then my brain's just like, okay, had enough now. The menopause is a wonderful thing.
I'll jump in and say, for the uninitiated, cupping means introducing your ram to the sheep for breeding. Just a little
Absolutely.
de-jargoning the farming world. When we moved to Shropshire, we had no idea what a tup was until this guy with this incredible thick accent came up and said, "The tups are in with the ewes." And we said, "Pardon? Can you repeat that?" And he said, "The tups are in with the ewes." And it was because our neighbor's sheep got mixed. And so we said, "Oh, okay, thank you so much for letting us know." And then we Googled it on the side because we did not know
Hopefully
what
you're
that
wrong,
meant.
because if you go into the lakes of Scotland, they start saying yows instead of ewes.
Yeah,
Down here we say rams really instead of tups,
yeah.
and then it sort of creeps up the country. But it's very interesting.
Yeah, I
I
love the
love it.
language around it. So we didn't know what the guy's name was. So for ages, when we saw him walking, we said, you know, Mr. Tup's in with the ewes, and then we just knew who we meant. Anyway, anecdotes aside. Um, so I thought I would de-jargon that for our good listeners. Um, if I can jump in and just sort of circle back, Alexia, what you were saying about doing the inner work. I think that's a really important piece. And it means shifting our mindsets, understanding that nature has rights, that we are a part of it, that we are not apart from it. But also it brings an interesting piece in because we have been so aggressively conditioned into being an individual, hyper individualistic. We have to look out for ourselves. No one else is coming to save us. But I think there's a piece there that we need to bring in, which is there's the inner work individually, but there's the inner work that we have to do as a society and make this shift from individual to community, to remembering that we are part of systems, ecosystems of care and belonging, and that humans existed and survived for, you know, thousands of years because we cooperated and we worked together, and different people had different functions within communities. And those have been, along with that mechanization and convenience and marketing, and the simplification of our lives, um, there is great complexity, but in a sense, it has become so oversimplified that you eat, work, sleep, and
Mm.
and we lose so much of the connection to, Olivia, you talk about the the wholesome sort of the ironing, the cooking, the connecting with your landscape to forage and connect with what's in season, and enjoying the slowing down of doing those tangible, changing things. Um, I think that there are threads there about connecting with land and connecting with our communities and not just being an automaton, an individual navigating the world, feeling isolated, feeling lonely, struggling, but remembering that we're not just part of an ecosystem of organisms like soil and plants and animals and living things, but also human ecosystems where we have to connect with one another and work together. Um, which
Absolutely.
it's something I'm finding really interesting right now because I'm seeing a real desire for it. We have.
I recently did an interview with Farmers Weekly, and it was asking about my opinion on new entrants coming into farming, but also we touched upon what you just said, the mental health, the isolation. It's never become an issue for us. I mean, I know we started through a mental health crisis, but since that, and what I talk about in my book is the working in uh, working with nature in that slowing down process. My body calls for it even now, and that's why we said in before recording that I had a complete reset at the weekend where I go and forage, and I love to nurture and I love to do things for my family, but it's also self-care for me. It's like an absolute reset. And with busy lives, I think it's imperative that we do that. So farming for me has never felt isolated because I'm with nature, and nature gives me so much. The bird song in the morning is enough to really just energize people. You just sit there with your coffee or whatever and sit there and wake up with everything. It's just, how could you feel lonely?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just a powerful thing for me, and I know, Daphne, you get a lot from it, personally, being out with your orchard, and like you say, things come into bloom, and it's just like, wow, there it is. That's that burst of energy, and it almost like ignites you inside as well to say, okay, it's time to come out of slumber. Let's crack on with making hay while the sun shines.
Yeah, and something, if I can add into it as well, that sort of pops out for me is, people who don't necessarily have access to green spaces or are feeling very trapped in terms of, I feel this desire and this need to slow down, but I can't because I have all of these responsibilities, or I don't see my way out of this system, even though I'm desperately desiring it. And I think it's important to recognize that and to also to kind of bring up as well. This is where I think things like the weeds, what we term the weeds, are some of our greatest teachers. And I'm thinking
Mm.
specifically of the dandelion, which for me is one of my favorite plants for a number of reasons, but particularly in the context of this conversation, where the dandelion creeps up in the most concrete of jungles, right? Like it finds its way in, and it's a reminder of that tenacity that we actually do have, and that the dandelion is a healing herb that we have deemed a weed. And this will come into what we're going to talk about as well in terms of dominion, chemical dominion over
The
nature.
arrogance of people.
The arrogance, exactly.
Arrogance.
Exactly. But also in terms of so I've talked about previously that whilst I'm not trained in traditional Chinese medicine, the philosophy of it very much informs my approach to health and specifically the way that I help in my canine nutrition practice. And what I tend to see is when you are following those seasons where spring becomes the time that the body is seeking detox, and it parallels the plants that start to bloom that are detox supports, dandelion being one of them. And when you
Mm.
start to watch dogs, not just, so this is related to what you were talking about, Olivia, with the foraging of the sheep, dogs self select as well. And we often
Mm.
worry, oh my God, my dog is eating grass. That means something's wrong. Not necessarily. Oftentimes, it's that they instinctively know I need this plant to help either repopulate my microbiome or they're on a detox. You'll often see dogs right now going for dandelion leaves because it's this season. It doesn't mean there's something wrong. It's the natural season of the body knowing I need to release these things and knowing exactly where to go in order to
Mm.
do that. And so that's where this reframe, when we're talking about the inner work, one of the things that comes up for me is this reframing of the assumptions, and to your point, Daphne, the arrogance that we have around labeling a plant or anything in a particular way. And when you start to do that reframe, all of a sudden your whole reality has the potential to shift because you are
Yeah.
seeing it through new eyes, which I think is really powerful when we're talking about this notion of rewilding and regeneration. What are your
Isn't that
thoughts?
interesting that it means just a hard line simplification of the environment and nature, that it is one thing, it is put in a box, it is not useful, which think of the lost potential there and the
Yeah.
lost engagement that we have to, all parts of the dandelion are edible. You can use it for a great many things. It has lots of benefits in different ways. And if we have, you know, dozens of uses and dozens of ways that it benefits us, multiply that by all the plants that we consider as weeds, think of all the knowledge that is sort of systematically being eroded by just
Mm.
labeling it as a weed, and how much just legacy and sort of oral history that has been passed down, which I mean with deliberate intention to take that knowledge away from people to in favor of the mechanization. But
Yeah.
it just, yeah, there's a grief there. I sort of feel a grief as you talk about that silly people. But all, I guess on the other sense, how phenomenal for the people who have the foresight or courage or intention or connection to be against the sort of conventional conversation, to say, actually, no, I think this is still important. Thank you very much. Social narrative be
Mm.
damned, which I value. I appreciate that very much.
And just to pick up on really quick, if that's all right, the notion of culture, not only the culture that we're losing, but I had a conversation with a dog behaviorist who is from Italy, but she's based in Sri Lanka, and she talks, her work is specifically about when we rehome these dogs, these feral dogs, and they're not feral in the way that we tend to think of it. They're free roaming or community dogs. There's a lot of different terms that are used to try to describe the way it is in which these dogs live outside of the way that we have kind of literally and figuratively like caged pets. They're not pets. 80% of the world's dog population lives like this. And there's this tendency, particularly when Western tourists go to places like Sri Lanka or India and see all of these dogs, they see the suffering, is what she was talking about. That's the only thing that they see. But she was describing how, from a kind of welfare perspective, if we're looking at say like the five categories of how we understand welfare, they have agency. They have their own community. And she said they have their own culture. And when we take them out of that culture, when there's that kind of rescuing, we see it here in the UK with the Romanian rescues, right? That those dogs struggle when they're put into the confines of being a pet. And in large part, that's the expectations that we're putting on them. But it's also that we have completely forgotten or not even acknowledged that they have their own culture. And I think when we start to expand that notion of culture from just what we humans have created and the way that we understand it amongst ourselves, that for me starts to beg these questions that we're asking about dominion and rights. And we see that with the push to grant legal rights, legal status to things like rivers, for example. But in reality, what happens when we expand that to understand that every living being is part of their own culture and has their own rights, and we decentralize the human from those decision-making processes? What does that open up not only for them, but actually, what does that return to us? Just gonna
I
float
think
that.
I think of food sovereignty and seed sovereignty. So agency is something that we have lost as we've become disconnected from our food, for example. And it's really interesting looking at river systems being granted personhood, for example. And we, how interesting that that is happening when people don't have agency and personhood. I think we have to do a lot of work, again, that internal work as a society to remember what makes people people and being able to choose what they eat and how they consume things as communities, as families. I think of an example from in the States in house planning. A lot of homes aren't being built with kitchens anymore. Not just not garden spaces, but lacking kitchens. So that communal food preparation, communal convivial consumption spaces is being removed. And so there's a massive element of sovereignty. In the UK, we're a signatory to the right to food, the Convention on the Right to Food. But how do you hold a government accountable to whether you are hungry or have sufficient or suitable access to food? You can't. So there are massive juggernauts of systems in play that keep us from having food sovereignty and seed sovereignty. Um, seed saving in so many places is illegal, just because big corporations have patented seeds, and so food is essentially growing your own food is an act of resistance and understanding where your food comes from. Um, Knowledge is a part of that resistance. So it is a massive rethink of culture and what we belong to, that we belong to the land and the land belongs to us, not companies, not water companies, not companies that, erode our soil and couple chemicals with food production. I think there's such an interesting link to what you're saying about the rights of animals to live appropriately with agency and dignity and land features, but we're not giving that to humans either. So we have to develop this concept on all fronts, don't we?
I think that's the real shift, what you're saying, from seeing ourselves as managers of systems to seeing ourselves as participants within them. And once you start to see things through that lens, it becomes very hard to then go back to thinking in terms of control alone. Um, and I, we have to realise we don't stand outside of the systems we've been speaking about here. We're already part of them, and maybe through regeneration is what happens when we start to act from that truth, rather than the separation. I don't, that's just my thoughts. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, well, something this isn't directly related to food, although it is, but it will tie into Daphne what you were talking about in terms of the chemical aspect of food production. But relating to seeing ourselves as participants within systems, something that's currently going on in the veterinary sector that I think is really demonstrative of this and offers a real potential for us to see ourselves as participants and to actually take action within it is as a bit of a background, the topical flea and tick treatments, and they are treatments, meaning that they treat when there is a problem, they don't prevent, are sold to people as preventatives. And the two primary drugs, fipronil and imidacloprid, that are used in these treatments were banned in the UK and EU agricultural sectors, but they remain present in the veterinary sector. So we know when they are showing up in the environment that they're coming from our pets. And there's massive pressure being put on the British Veterinary Association to stop the routine prescription of these drugs because we are seeing them in our waterways. We're seeing them in the soil. They're having devastating effects on our bird populations, on our insect populations, on our pollinator population, all of it. And so there's pressure to kind of stop using them when we don't have an actual issue. And one of the things that I see in my work in the canine nutrition sector is that there was a study that was done by the PDSA, which is a charity for supporting pets here in the UK. And they surveyed guardians who were using these drugs to get a better sense of how many people are actually using them and why are they using them. And they found that 81% of pet parents were using these drugs. And it was like 95% of that 81% were using them thinking that they were prevention.
Yeah.
And where I see the real opportunity is one, there's the whole conversation around the fear that we have of parasites and not really understanding them and not understanding them as part of the ecosystem and not understanding the relationship between the presence of parasites and whether or not that actually means disease transmission. In fact, there's actually a very low rate of disease transmission. But I understand they're scary, so this isn't diminishing that. But I think it starts to beg these other questions about understanding, for example, the role of parasites in the wider ecosystem, and that what they are doing is they prey on the weak. So when you then flip the mindset and you look at, so what do I do to make my dog's terrain as healthy as possible so my dog is not appealing to parasites? Then you start to come up with a whole host of different options for what you can do in terms of a layered approach of actual prevention. So, starting with a healthy immune system, which comes from feeding species appropriate fresh food, you start to look at things that you can be mitigating in your environment, using nematodes in your gardens, for example, or using appropriate essential oils like on a bandana when you go out for your walks and those kinds of things. But what happens within that when you start to recognize there's a lot that I can actually do, you become the one that's part of changing the system. And you can see it again through your little dog sat at your feet. This is where the system changes. When you say, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to take this other approach. And yes, this other approach requires a little bit more work, but we also know the detrimental health effects on our animals from these drugs as well. So, it's kind of weighing things up. But I think when we can start to see ourselves as direct participants that can have a positive effect on these big, overwhelming systems, that's where the change starts to happen. And when you're doing it for your dog with the flea and tick, you start to think about how you can do it in other ways as well. It opens that door to possibilities of affecting change in other ways.
Yeah. Totally does. Same with soil. Daphne and I would be really familiar with this. Soil fertility drops. What do people go and do? They add a fertilizer. Animal health declines. So what do? We go and medicate, and then you see something pulled from the market because it's been overused and incorrectly used. We had a great example of that during lambing, and so. Dominion thrives in fragmentation, doesn't it? It's that vicious cycle. It's rooted in fear, I think, personally. I think, we have fear of loss, fear of sort of uncertainty, fear of nature's unpredictability. Control then becomes a way to create am I trying to say? The illusion of security.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but nature teaches us to resist, control, and it operates in cycles, feedback loops, and complexity. So then, so the more we try to dominate, the more intervention becomes necessary, doesn't it? And this is how all these systems like farming become extractive, right? Soil becomes depleted, biodiversity declines, systems become then very, very brittle. In we're seeing it so much. So instead of being part of an ecosystem, the farmer then becomes the manager, responsible for weather, for soil, for disease, for markets, for fertility, for biodiversity, absolutely everything. And that's a heavy role in itself. It's like, and the one, I don't know. It's quite scary when you say it about the fleas and stuff like that, and it's become because so many of us are pet lovers, so it's something that we can all kind of understand that topic, right? Not everyone's a farmer, so they don't get it. But since knowing you, Alexia, I did exactly what you said. I thought it was preventative. I've stopped using it, and now waiting as the weather turns to have infestation. But I've also, implemented other things that you said about making broth. It was something I would do anyway in terms of, utilizing the carcass, but not giving it to my dog. And I don't know why I didn't do that, but there's been such a difference with him. And I've also started implementing, this is not an ad, by the way, microbes for my pets. So I use it on myself, and I've been using it now for the 4 months to control my hormones. And I've really noticed the change in my gut health, my thinking, and it's really now I can start seeing it in my animals. It's so good. So
Well,
I just love everything you say.
oh, thank you. But it comes from me having that same experience. And I think one of the things that I find in caring for Lucky in that way, it's very similar to what you were talking about, Olivia, in terms of the the things that slow you down and reconnect you. And I think the more that I started diving into this stuff around the dogs, I saw them and what we do for them as, or can do for them if we're not doing it already, as a real opportunity to connect us. And I find it really funny. It's speaking on the microbe thing. we hear in both the human health sector and in the pet health sector about the importance of soil-based bacteria, of various microbes, of like even things like humic and fulvic acid for our health. And I think we've forgotten that we used to get that when we were picking our veg from the ground, right? Like that was part, like
Yeah.
when you have your hands in the ground, that is part of that. But now it's packaged to us as go buy this product that has these
Mm.
things. And it's like, well, if we were just reconnecting to the ground and actually in relationship with these systems, but of course, that's not what makes money. But but do you know what I mean? It's like we're seeing it on every level, this that what we really need is that reconnection.
It's diversity, isn't
And I
it?
think that's why greenhouses smell so much better than in a supermarket. You go in there and it physically makes you hungry. It's attacking all of your senses, right? And now I've been out to the allotment and foraging, as Daphne said this weekend, and that physical touch of having your hands in the soil, and Daphne will vouch for this wholeheartedly. It has such a chemical shift to your own mental health. So it's just so empowering, and it's probably what makes us who we are, Daphne, don't you think, in terms of, being custodians and vouching for this with working with people and campaigning and everything. But we've lived through that whole transition. We weren't like that at the beginning, but now we see the benefits of it. And it does take time, it does take patience, and it takes a lot of understanding.
I think it's paralleled in an interesting way to, I mean, we have been farming for 10,000 years, and the diversity of our farmed stuff and our gathered and foraged stuff, our diets were so much more varied and complex. Not to say that we are healthier because there was a lot going on. Obviously, there are lots of advances that we've made, but the diversity of our food was so much broader. And now corporatization has minimized that and simplified it, not just in the diversity of the individual varieties of things, those 6 different types of apples that you can buy in the shop, rather than the thousands of different varieties that are actually available. Um, there is such a loss there. And now products are being marketed to, rediversify your diet, 30 different types of plants a week. And previously, in our development as an agrarian society, it was thousands. So there is a loss there. There's a loss to our diets and our social components. I think diversity is really central. And something like, I think it's 94.5% of the food that we buy is from grocery stores, and that is owned by 11 corporations. So
Mm.
we lose that food sovereignty, we lose that connection, we lose that diversity, we lose those skills and the process of engaging with it ourselves. And I think just like the fleas and the parasites, a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding means fear. That we are anxious about the what ifs. But if we skill ourselves up a bit, if we sit back and we watch and observe and we look at systems more holistically, which is a regenerative principle, then we might be able to understand things better rather than a really simplified, a sort of minimalistic lens. And I think that's the approach that we're seeing in organic and regenerative and agroecological farming. And the interesting thing there, I think, considering if we sort of take a step back and look at our sort of global food context right now, which is in crisis, they are the ones coming back, the farmers who have those approaches and who have built in that systems thinking to reduce inputs, reduce chemical dependency. They are the ones who are going, actually, just by that process, we have insulated ourselves against these shocks so much more. So healthy systems, whether physical systems or in, structural systems, are healthier where there's diversity, are healthier where there's a holistic approach, and where they're not completely reliant on one single input or one single corporation. Um, I find that's a really interesting piece in our food resilience conversations that we do through my charity, the Shropshire Good Food Partnership, or on my farm in courses, people, as sort of taking the temperature, the social temperature of things, people are anxious about food systems, food access, food quality, the kind of food that kids are getting in schools, ultra processed food, weight loss jabs. We are so fragmented and disconnected. And there is a huge sense of fear. But what we can do is counter that with skills and confidence building and knowledge
Yeah.
and confidence building, which is a really interesting conversation to have with our councils that don't understand food systems and the links across their organizations and departments and portfolios, or with communities who are worried about, well, what happens if there's a crisis? Will we not have enough? Is someone going to try to come and take what we've got? Without thinking of the interplay of being systems thinkers and producing more of our own, having that sovereignty and having that diversity. um, I think that's something that's really, really alive for me right now. Um, so bringing it back to people, knowledge, skills, and slowing down to observe systems.
I love that. It's something that I'm doing again, using the dogs as a gateway for this is I'm a big believer in making your own dog food and understanding. And in fact, I don't like calling it dog food. It's food for your dogs. It's like food is food. And but doing it intentionally so you understand what a dog needs and what provides those nutrients and doing it in that kind of intentional way. But one of the reasons I'm really keen on making food like that is because it gives you agency, it gives you sovereignty. You're not reliant upon corporations creating food because you don't know how to do it. You know how to do it. And so you can source what there is around you in order to do that. But again, that translates directly because I will see or hear people say, I can't cook for my dog because I don't know how to cook for myself. So back to your guys' work about educating skills with that, I'm doing it via the dog. So I'm actually running some workshops on teaching you how to make your dog's food, not just for that, but because when you can do that, because it's so easy to do, that you can then have a sense of confidence of, I could do this for myself. I could
Yeah.
learn how to upskill myself. It's not something that's so scary anymore because it kind of hides behind this veil of fear of if you don't balance everything perfectly, your dog is going to die. And I'm not saying not, like, you do need to understand what a dog needs. This isn't about like willy-nilly just throwing stuff in. But when you have that sense of understanding, then all of a sudden you are free to not be reliant on these big systems, to not be reliant on people telling you exactly what needs to be done and then withholding the product from you or any of that kind of stuff. And the beauty is that when you get that confidence, you will start to do it for yourself, which I think is just so important. So that's my little way of helping to shift
Well,
the
it
upskilling.
does take one thing, right? Which gives you the confidence to then try, okay, I did that fine, so let's try something else. And I said on my Instagram yesterday, we started composting 2 years ago, and this was the first time we could actually use it. And it's such amazing compost. I didn't have to screen it or anything, and it's so rich. And it's so cooking a meal yesterday, Forest, a lot of it had a lot of it grown ourselves. And we I'm still sort of having like planned lunches with an abundance of tomatoes from last year's harvest and runner beans and things like that. But then your waste goes back in, and it's so satisfying that I now, I mean, I obviously in all my work I talk about circular systems, but it's so nice to be able to have that within my own home. And the one thing that held me back was like laundry detergent. And it's so now, well, last autumn I made loads of it myself through Ivy and Conkers. I've got a whole pantry full of stuff, and it's kept me going. And it's like, okay, now I can see it depleting, and it can't wait for autumn to top it all up. It's time consuming, but it's that whole practice of knowing that you are taking control back and you are not feeding into this dominion of corporations that are just about greed and do not care in 1 ounce what is happening to our lives, our health, or anything like that. And I'm all for standing up against these corporations, so I would do anything. I haven't mastered making toilet rolls yet, but when I do, I'll share.
Yeah, it's such an interesting space because there are so many skills that we've lost, and it's been what we have exchanged as from our own control and power for convenience, and what we've
Yeah.
given up for convenience. And we see it's been replicated really effectively across every single sector. It's food,
Mm,
it's health, it's water systems, it's feed for animals, um, all of these different things, tech. Um, Now it's based on a subscription system and it's an essential thing. So you get looped into it and looped into it, and it's very difficult to extract yourself. So extracting ourselves in certain ways and dismantling those systems and our reliance on them. It's Alexia, I really enjoyed your point about when you see it in one place, you start to see it as a pattern everywhere. And it's really interesting when people start making those connections and all of a sudden the veil lifts and people become aware. And I think for some, it was the shocks of the pandemic. For others, it was the cost of living crisis. I think a really interesting example was during the pandemic when more and more people were accessing food banks and working people, um, teachers, nurses, who all of a sudden were accessing food banks. And to a degree, the stigma started to drop away because it was viewed not as no longer as a personal failing. It was the system is failing us. The structures are not in place there to support us. And through the programs that we run through the Food Partnership to build community resilience, we came in at a point to say, here's growing and here's cooking skills. But we had some people come back and say, will you take us grocery shopping? Because we don't know how to grocery shop. And that's an interesting one that we'd never thought about, that people need help navigating products, labels,
yeah.
cost savings, purchasing. What is a whole ingredient? Why is it that most of the shop is ultra processed and those are the ones that you have to go through to get to the end, to the till? These systems are designed to take away our knowledge and our skills and our sovereignty. Um, a lot of interest that I've gotten in our farm courses, or that I've had requested over and over, is when are you going to teach a food preservation course? And
Yeah.
I always thought, gosh, I know I do it for myself. I know I do a range of things for my home and my family, but I'm not an expert. And that's always that little thing, right? Whether it's your activism, oh, I'm not good enough, it's that imposter syndrome. But I've come to realize that even my 10 years of experience doing this is expert level to somebody
Yeah.
who hasn't yet started that journey. And we can learn together and we can hold hands and we can go through and look at what is dehydration and how do you use the abundance of the season? How do you make teas and dry your herbs? How do you make, pesto from wild garlic that's growing in the forest, or bottling or canning or all of these different things? It seems like the occult to some people because they've been sold this narrative of, well, come on, let's keep it simple. Your time is really precious, but actually trading your time and your skills means that you are less healthy, have lower quality of life, and you're more vulnerable.
Mm.
Is that worth the trade-off? And I think that's what a lot of people are waking up to and becoming more aware of, and they see it in their food system and their tech systems
I
and
definitely
clients.
that. I love what you just said there because I volunteer at a local pantry, um, so a food bank, and with that we do workshops and things like how to grow veg. how to forage. And in this week coming up, I've got a bread course with some children, and it's surprising. They're always sold out really quickly. The uptake is huge on these, but reiterating what both of you say, there's so little lack of cooking skills and knowledge, that knowledge sharing. And I'm about to do exactly what you said, Daphne, in terms of county council level, and incorporating a similar program in our village to grow food and have a community space to teach all of this. And just waiting for the local elections, really, because I want to know who I'm dealing with, right? It's not great. That's a different conversation, but it's when people start to do this and you hear the feedback, they're hungry to know more. They want to know more. You've just sparked something so wonderful in their mindsets, and they're like, oh, do you know what? I didn't realize how easy it was. And or you've taken away that fear from them. You've put a human level on it. And I think that really helps, because you don't have to know everything. None of us do, but it's how we change someone else's thought processes, life, health for the better. And if that's just one, that's great, right? We've done our jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And our ancestors have been doing this for millennia. How is it that it's just in 2 generations that we've lost this? It's an incredible cultural loss. It's essentially the dark ages of knowledge.
Mm,
And so it's our birthright in a sense as well.
mm,
So coming back to
I like
that, yeah, and that connection is so significant. And I think, just to jump on your local council point, food is so interesting because it is our superpower tool. It is our multi-tool that, regardless of which side of the divide your elected officials are on, the big theme that we are talking about now in food policy is food resilience. And
mm,
whether you are looking at that from the perspective of who is vulnerable in my community and most likely to drop off the radar if there's a crisis, or food security as national security, or relocalizing our food systems to promote local farmers, there is
mm,
something in that dialogue. There's a hook for anyone, regardless of where they stand in the political spectrum. And so the work that I've been doing with our sort of web of organizations across the UK called the Sustainable Food Places Network, we are going to local councils and working in our counties and our bioregions, and winging that up to the national level to say, we have organizations that we're calling ourselves the mobilizing middle, because we have our citizens and we have our politicians at the top, but we're the ones who are, um, as food partnerships, who understand these connections in the food systems and the assets and the gaps, are saying, hey, wake up, folks at the top, and come along, folks at the bottom. We have work to do. And I think that the really practical capacity building and skills development is exactly the narrative that people need right now. That sense of
yeah.
connection and awakening.
Parliament and councils don't work. Normally, councils are like two years behind, which is important. You're having conversations with both, right? Which is, I'm finding Parliament so much easier than councils, but it will come.
Social acupuncture. We have to poke things at different levels at different times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's through demonstration that you then come forward with the evidence to validate what you're saying. And once you got that, there's no argument for politicians to say, actually, no, you're right. They've got one job to do, and that's to protect the public, which they're miserably failing on.
Mm.
I think that's one part of it. I totally agree. We have to come up with evidence and say, hey, this works, and we've been doing it. Equally, I'm not a big one for asking for permission if it's going to take too long. We
No,
just do it with the
no,
grassroots and we get on with it,
do
because no
it.
one else is coming to save us. We've got to skill
Yeah,
up and be confident and do our thing too.
Yeah.
totally. Yeah.
I wanted to kind of bring some things around that you guys are mentioning, and Daphne, you specifically used the term of food being an awakener, this helping us to awaken. And I think there's also that side. We started this conversation with talking about the inner and the outer. And I think something that I see quite a bit as well is when you are pushed against your own limitations and you start arguing for your limitations. I see this with pet parents that you're giving them the sort of program of what they need to do to help get their dog on a healthy track. And they'll come up with all these reasons why they can't do something. And
Mm.
what I've come to understand is it's a kind of it's the paradox of they do need the skill sets, and the issue that is coming up in their dog is awakening something within them. It's an internal battle, whether that be something that from a more spiritual perspective, that I would say that they're here like a core wound that they're here to explore and to heal. So the lack of cooking skills might actually come from and their kind of confrontation with, can I do this? Of being told as a child, like you're worthless, you can't do anything right, and all of that. And I think those things are at play more than we necessarily are aware of or cognizant of. And so what I see is we are sort of tasked, those of us that are wanting to help support, we're sort of tasked with both the practical skill teaching of things and also looking at all of these issues are part of our awakening journey. And so then what is there to help support that side of this? Because it's not a black and white issue. It's not just about we need the skills. It's an and conversation. And I think that's another part that gets often missed out that I think we're kind of poised to be able to highlight and start to question. So, what systems do we need, or various types of support do we need to help facilitate that level of awakening for people as well?
I think communication is one of the key challenges of, for one, our time, um, because it's being dominated by some voices, but also of the work that I do. It's, I think exactly what you say, Alexia, is people are, there's a lot of fear and a lot of discomfort that people don't want to face. It's scary. Times are scary. Uncertainty is difficult. Not feeling tooled up is a worry, and that fear of failure and not doing things properly. Um, I think that we have to communicate to people that it's an all of society engagement that we need. And if you aren't happy with how things are right now, get involved and fix it. I think sort of a passive expectation that somebody's going to intervene, some sort of benign force is going to come in and make things right, is not something we can rely on. So communicating to people, whether it's how to think in systems or how to take that first step, depending on where people are in their journey, is the job of people who can be those storytellers or create examples and share what those examples look like. And it might be an example of, this is how you soak beans, or this is how you make a balanced meal, or it might be, this is how you create a, non-typical community-owned initiative with alternative infrastructure. It's fractal. It can be tiny, but it can scale out. And I think that that's sort of what regenerative farming is. And it comes from a place of reconnection, and that's what I see it at the core. Yeah.
Mhm.
Olivia, do you have any thoughts as we're kind of wrapping this up?
So many. I think this is a conversation that could just go on and on and then. But I think, I love what Daphne has just said, communication. But when you actually work within these systems that we're talking about today, it stops being a method and becomes a posture. It requires humility. It requires you slowing down and slowing down assumptions about control. and it requires a willingness from participants to not always be the one or ones directing outcomes. I just I think it's a great way to end the conversation. I think, you know, it would be nice for our listeners to go away and have, after having a listen to our podcast, and sharing their thoughts with us on whether they've made a little shift, whether we've made think about making a shift, and what would that shift be. And it can be so simple. It doesn't have to be time consuming to a degree. You know, it can just start so minuscule, but really understanding that they are nature, and without nature we are nothing. And we should really be investing in that rather than Dominion corporations.
That makes me think of the the slow food movement.
Mm.
And it's an example that's close to my heart. I became aware of the slow food movement 20 years ago, and it is about provenance. It's where things come from and how it's done. And it came up in counter to McDonald's setting up in Trevi, in Italy, in Rome. And it took a cultural force of people being so aghast by this, you know, out of the box American company as a franchise coming up in a renowned world food center. And the slow food movement has developed as a global phenomenon since, and it reminds people of quality and that good things take time. And I think that there's something to that. And maybe it's the difference is people reconnecting with a product and buying something that is crafted rather than mass produced. Um, Maybe it means buying rice that you boil yourself instead of the, you know, Uncle Ben's in a microwavable packet. Maybe it is, oh gosh, we talk about cider in what is craft cider? Craft cider is, it has as much summer in it as it does winter. There's a whole year's worth of process, more than a year's worth of process that goes into it, rather than the sort of 3 weeks of mass-produced cider with, you know, a fraction of it being real apple juice. What is real and what makes it special? What makes it an occasion? Um, and something that we can really celebrate and enjoy. Find the joy in all of this. That's what food gives us as a superpower, when it's good food, when it's diverse food. So maybe I love, Olivia, your suggestion of how people can make changes, and maybe what can they make in terms of changes to what they're choosing or eating or where they're buying from at this season, where abundance is going to start really piling in from our local
Yeah,
farms. Um,
definitely. But one simple way, even if you can't grow your own or you don't have the space, it's just like, you know, there's obviously some people that do have greater space, and they sell them in honesty boxes and stuff like that. And I'm always I love honesty boxes. I'm a huge fan, and they seem to be quite prevalent the further up the country you go, which I just, obviously, any escape and I'm there. But it's even things like you say, boiling rice yourself, which is an act that I actually did a good few years back now. But I try, and so we are now as a family a good 97% ultra processed food free. Uh, um, but I think if you know, they do like to rebel against me sometimes, and go and have something fast from a drive-through, shall we say? And but it's all about balance. But I think if, I had two wonderful conversations this week. I went to visit a friend last week, and she said, you know what, your knowledge and through our shared conversations has made me and my sister really start looking at food labels when we go and shopping.
Right.
And she's learned so much, and she's like, what else can I look for? So she's getting food out of her fridge. She's showing me what she's buying and stuff. So I've given her another task. And then another conversation in our local shop. And this lady, the cashier, was saying, God, you eat so healthy. It's so expensive eating healthy. And it's like, it's really expensive to taxpayers that, the NHS is overwhelmed through people not taking care of their food and their bodies and what they're putting in. And I said, so, what's the balance? Do you value the cost of food and your health more? Or, and I get that it's hard. It's because it's hard, but it's about making one change a week, right? If you go to the supermarkets, can you afford to swap to one organic veg, even if it's one pepper? Just making that little shift, or understanding the codes on an egg box, so you know whether it's caged or whether it's free range. Just educating yourself into the smallest task, but it's one task a week.
I think there's also a link with what Alexia said earlier about when you see one thing differently, you start to see everything differently. And what has jumped out from what you've just said is time, the time frame. I'm trading a little bit of something now for something long term. I'm kicking it down the line where the
Yeah.
impacts will only reveal themselves fully, whether in my health or ecologically or economically, they get kicked down the line. And that's what we've been doing. And for the
Mm,
last, generation, our consumption has picked up and picked up and picked up as we push the consequences further down the line. But actually, that further down the line is getting closer now.
yeah,
So
it is.
I think that that's a really interesting way that when people start to think of it, with that indigenous 7 generations, how is my action right now going to impact 7 generations down, or even the next generation, which we haven't
Yeah.
been thinking about? How will they start seeing their actions and the time frames start to develop? Maybe that will make people think
Maybe
about.
that time, that conversation.
There we go. I think it would be really nice to leave you guys as well with something that is kind of current in my little world. I'm rereading Clarissa Pinkola Estes's book, Women Who Run with the Wolves. And she talks about our desire to reconnect with the wild woman. And she talks about this across different cultures. But she said, you really notice that the wild woman within you is calling out when you want to put your hands in the dirt, for example, because that is what we've done, reconnecting to that sense of of our true nature, true to the wild. And it's why there are so many stories as well that ties into why we are called seeds and bones, that link back to the bones as well,
Mm,
of of that sense of wildness and of that sense of the rhythms of nature, and that calling back upon the wisdom that has been passed down through our bones. And so, something I would like to leave listeners with as a small thing you can do is just go put your hands and your feet on the ground. It could be as simple as that, and reconnect to the world around you.
oh, yeah, it's nothing like having bare feet on the ground.
As it gets a bit
When did
warmer.
when did we stop doing that as kids?
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Brilliant.
Ladies, it's been wonderful as always. I'm looking forward to our next conversation, which is coming out for the summer solstice here in the Northern Hemisphere, or winter solstice in the Southern Hemisphere.
A pleasure as always. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you. It was lovely.
As we close this early summer conversation, perhaps the invitation is not to leave with certainty or answers, but with deeper questions. questions about what it means to belong, about what we are being asked to release, about the stories, systems, and patterns of consciousness that no longer serve life, either within us or around us. Maybe regeneration begins there, not in control, but in relationship, not in domination, but in participation, in remembering that we are not separate from the living world, but threads within it. As this blue moon illuminates what is ready to be let go, we hope that this conversation has offered space to reflect on what you might be unlearning, softening, or returning to in your own life. Thank you for sitting around the fire with us for this chapter of Seeds and Bones. Our next episode will air on the summer solstice, a threshold moment of fullness, light, and turning, and we cannot wait to continue the conversation with you then. Until next time, you can follow along or reach out to us on Instagram at Seeds and Bones Podcast. And wherever you are, may you find a moment to place your hands on the earth and remember that you belong to her too.